The alarm sounded throughout USS Missouri. General quarters, enemy aircraft inbound, kamikazes. Japanese suicide pilots were diving straight at the battleship at tremendous speed, intent on crashing their bomb-laden aircraft directly into our hull. This was the reality of late-stage Pacific naval warfare. This was what happened when desperate Japanese pilots decided that dying for their emperor was better than accepting defeat. I was at the 40mm Bofors gun position, and I had seconds to prepare for what was about to happen. The 40mm Bofors was one of the most effective anti-aircraft weapons ever mounted on an American warship. It was an automatic cannon that fired high explosive rounds at a cyclic rate of fire that was absolutely devastating. The gun could engage multiple targets simultaneously. The gun could track fast-moving aircraft. The gun could deliver concentrated firepower that could tear apart enemy aircraft. The gun was our primary defense against the kamikazes that were screaming toward us through the sky. My gun crew was absolutely professional. We had trained for this exact scenario countless times. We knew exactly what we had to do. We knew that our performance in the next few minutes would determine whether USS Missouri survived this attack or whether we would be hit by a suicide aircraft. We understood that the stakes could not possibly be higher. We understood that Japanese pilots were willing to die to take us down. The first kamikaze appeared on the horizon. It was a Japanese fighter bomber diving at an angle toward the battleship. The pilot had already committed to the attack. He was not going to pull up. He was not going to change his mind. He was flying straight at us with the intention of crashing his aircraft into our ship. The closing speed was incredible. The aircraft was moving so fast that we had only seconds to react. I took position at the 40mm Bofors gun. My hands gripped the firing controls. My eyes tracked the incoming kamikaze as it descended toward the battleship. My gun crew was ready. The ammunition handlers were prepared to feed rounds into the magazine. The other gunners were ready to assist. This was it. This was the moment when the 40mm Bofors guns of USS Missouri were going to defend the battleship against Japanese suicide attacks. This was the moment when American naval firepower was going to demonstrate why we could overcome any threat, no matter how desperate or how suicidal. Before we get into the explosive details of what happened when the 40mm Bofors guns of USS Missouri opened up on those Japanese kamikazes, I've got to ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Are you in New York? Maybe you're down in Texas or California. Could be you're somewhere completely unexpected that I never would have imagined. Drop your city in the comments below because I genuinely want to know who's watching this incredible story and where you're tuning in from. And while you're down there in the comments, hit that like button if this story about USS Missouri destroying kamikazes is blowing your mind. Show YouTube you want more military history content like this, and if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, what are you doing? We've got incredible stories about American naval power and American victories dropping all the time. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss another video about the greatest warships ever built and the brave men who fought on them. All right, let's get back to what happened because the next few minutes were absolutely intense. The USS Missouri was the last battleship ever built by the United States Navy. It was one of the most powerful warships in the entire world. The battleship carried 9 massive 16-inch guns in 3 triple-gun turrets that could deliver devastating firepower against surface targets. But in the Pacific War, during the final stages of conflict with Japan, surface combat was not the primary threat. The primary threat came from the air. The primary threat came from Japanese aircraft, and particularly from kamikazes, Japanese suicide pilots who had been ordered to crash their bomb-laden aircraft into American ships. The 40mm Bofors gun was the primary anti-aircraft weapon mounted on modern American warships. The gun had been developed in Sweden and licensed for American production. It was a marvel of engineering, representing cutting-edge weapons technology. The gun was semi-automatic, meaning that once the gunner pulled the trigger, the weapon would fire repeatedly until the trigger was released. The gun could sustain a rate of fire of approximately 120 rounds per minute. Each round was a high-explosive projectile that could detonate on impact or after a predetermined time delay. The gun mounted on USS Missouri had a crew of 6 men. There was the gun captain who commanded the crew and aimed the weapon. There were ammunition handlers who loaded rounds into the magazine and fed ammunition to the gun. There was a loader who positioned rounds for the gun captain to fire. There was a pointer who controlled the gun's elevation and a trainer who controlled the gun's lateral movement to track moving targets. Every man had a critical role to play. Every man understood that their performance was essential to the survival of the ship and the crew. The 40mm Bofors was effective against aircraft at ranges up to approximately 7,000 yards. At closer ranges, the gun was absolutely devastating. The high-explosive rounds could tear through aircraft fuselages. The rounds could destroy engines. The rounds could kill pilots. When multiple 40mm Bofors guns fired simultaneously at a kamikaze, the concentrated firepower was nearly impossible for any aircraft to survive. The gun crews understood this. The gun crews understood that they were the battleship's last line of defense against suicide attacks. American naval personnel manning the 40mm Bofors guns had received extensive training. They had practiced tracking fast-moving aircraft. They had practiced calculating lead angles to account for aircraft movement. They had practiced responding to commands and executing fire sequences. They understood the critical nature of their role. They understood that a single moment of hesitation, a single moment of uncertainty, could mean the difference between a successful defense and a successful kamikaze attack on the USS Missouri. The sailors who manned these guns were young men, many of them barely out of their teens. They came from farms and cities and small towns across America. They had volunteered or been drafted into the Navy. They had received months of training in gunnery and naval combat. They had experienced multiple combat operations. They had seen other ships hit by kamikazes. They had seen the devastating effects of suicide aircraft attacks. And now they were about to defend USS Missouri from kamikaze attacks using the 40mm Bofors guns. The radar operators aboard USS Missouri were calling out targets, multiple inbound bogies, multiple Japanese aircraft approaching the battleship. The aircraft were at various altitudes and on different vectors. Some were attempting to approach from the bow. Some were attempting to approach from the stern. Some were attempting to approach from the port and starboard sides. The Japanese were trying to overwhelm the battleship's air defenses with multiple simultaneous attacks from different directions. The kamikazes were desperate. They were the last weapon that Japan possessed that could inflict damage on American warships. The Japanese Navy had been decimated in surface engagements. The Japanese Air Force had been nearly destroyed in aerial combat. The only weapon system that Japan had left was the kamikaze pilots, young men who had been trained to fly their aircraft straight into American warships and detonate their bombs at the moment of impact. These pilots were not trained in air combat. These pilots were not trained in defensive flying. These pilots had only one mission, one objective: to crash their aircraft into an American ship and die in the process. The first kamikaze was visible now. It was a Japanese Zero fighter with a bomb load attached to the fuselage. The pilot was diving at an angle toward the battleship. The closing speed was incredible. The aircraft was moving so fast that the distance was closing at a rate of nearly 500 miles per hour. The pilot was committed to the attack. There was no possibility of the kamikaze breaking off the attack and attempting to escape. The pilot had already made his final decision. He was going to crash this aircraft into USS Missouri. My 40mm Bofors gun was tracking the inbound kamikaze. The gun captain was calling out corrections to the pointer and trainer. The gunners were calculating the lead angle necessary to intercept the rapidly closing aircraft. The ammunition handlers had loaded rounds into the magazine. The gun was ready to fire. We were ready to engage the Kamikaze before it could reach the battleship. The other 40mm Bofors guns on the battleship were also tracking the incoming aircraft. The gunners were coordinating with each other through the ship's communication system. We were attempting to establish interlocking fields of fire. We were attempting to create a wall of anti-aircraft fire that the Kamikazes could not possibly penetrate. The Japanese pilots had no way to maneuver through such concentrated firepower. The Japanese pilots could not evade guns that were already tracking them. The Japanese pilots could only continue straight toward the battleship and hope that they could penetrate the anti-aircraft defense. The air around USS Missouri was filled with tension. Every sailor aboard knew what was about to happen. Every sailor understood that the next few minutes would be absolutely critical. Every sailor understood that the 40mm Bofors guns represented the battleship's only chance to stop the Kamikazes before they reached the ship. Every sailor was absolutely ready for what was about to occur. The gun captain gave the command, "Open fire!" I pressed the trigger on the 40mm Bofors gun. The weapon roared to life, firing high explosive rounds at a cyclic rate that was absolutely devastating. The gun was bucking and shaking as it fired. The spent shell casings were ejecting from the weapon and falling to the deck. The smell of cordite and burning gunpowder filled the air around the gun position. The entire battleship seemed to be filled with the sound of anti-aircraft guns firing. The 40mm rounds were traveling at velocities over 2,000 feet per second. They were traveling in a direct line from my gun toward the incoming Kamikaze. At the closing speed between the gun and the aircraft, the distance was closing incredibly fast. The rounds were striking the Japanese Zero. I could see the impacts. I could see the aircraft being torn apart by the high explosive rounds. The fuselage was being perforated, the wings were being damaged, the engine was being struck multiple times. But the Kamikaze was still coming. Even though the aircraft was being torn apart by machine gun fire, even though the aircraft was streaming smoke from multiple hits, even though the aircraft was clearly damaged beyond any possibility of repair, the pilot was continuing straight toward the battleship. The pilot was committed to the attack. The pilot was not going to break off. The pilot was not going to try to save himself. The pilot was going to crash this aircraft into USS Missouri or die trying. I kept firing. My ammunition handlers were working frantically to keep rounds moving into the magazine. My loader was positioning rounds for continuous fire. The entire gun crew was operating at peak efficiency. We understood that every single round we fired might be the round that destroyed the Kamikaze before it could reach the battleship. We understood the stakes. We understood that our performance in the next few seconds would determine the fate of the USS Missouri. The other 40mm Bofors guns on the battleship were also firing. The 20-minute guns were firing. The larger caliber guns were firing. The entire battleship was erupting with anti-aircraft firepower. The sky around USS Missouri was filled with high explosive rounds and tracer ammunition. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire and the concussions from thousands of rounds being fired simultaneously. The Kamikaze was less than 1,000 yards away now. The aircraft was heavily damaged. The fuselage was torn. One wing was partially detached. The engine was on fire. But the pilot was still flying straight toward the battleship. The pilot was still committed to the Kamikaze attack. My 40mm Bofors gun continued firing. The rounds were striking the aircraft repeatedly. The Kamikaze was barely holding together. The pilot was barely keeping the aircraft in the air, but the aircraft was still coming. The aircraft was still a threat. The Japanese Zero finally broke apart. The aircraft had absorbed too much damage. The fuselage could no longer hold together. The wings separated from the fuselage. The aircraft disintegrated into pieces. The debris fell from the sky. The bomb load attached to the aircraft fell into the ocean. The pilot was dead. The kamikaze attack had been defeated. The USS Missouri had survived this attack, but the battle was not over. There were more kamikazes inbound. The radar operators were calling out additional targets, multiple bogies still approaching the battleship. The 40mm Bofors gun crews continued firing. The ammunition handlers continued loading rounds. The entire battleship continued pouring anti-aircraft firepower into the sky. The gunners tracked the next kamikaze as it descended toward the battleship. The second kamikaze was also struck by concentrated anti-aircraft fire from multiple 40mm Bofors guns. The aircraft was torn apart by high-explosive rounds. The fuselage was perforated, the wings were damaged, the engine was struck multiple times, but like the first kamikaze, the pilot continued straight toward the battleship. The pilot refused to break off the attack. The pilot was absolutely determined to reach the USS Missouri. My 40mm Bofors gun continued firing. The ammunition handlers were loading rounds as fast as they could. The gun barrel was hot from the sustained firing, but there was no time to think about fatigue or heat. There was only the mission. There was only the need to continue firing at the incoming kamikazes. There was only the understanding that our gun crew's performance was essential to the survival of the battleship. The second kamikaze came closer and closer. The aircraft was barely flying. The aircraft was being held together by pieces and prayers. But the pilot was still flying straight toward USS Missouri. The aircraft was less than 500 yards away now. The aircraft was less than 1,000 feet above the water. The aircraft was almost at the battleship. Then, at the absolute last moment, something inside the damaged aircraft finally gave out. The engine failed completely. The aircraft stalled. The aircraft dropped from the sky like a rock. The dying kamikaze fell into the ocean, just off the port side of USS Missouri. The impact created a massive splash of water. The aircraft sank beneath the waves. The bomb load detonated in the ocean, sending a column of water up into the air. But the USS Missouri had survived this attack as well. The gun crews maintained their positions. The gunners continued tracking the remaining kamikazes. The ammunition handlers continued loading rounds. The battle continued. More kamikazes appeared, more attacks were launched, more high-explosive rounds were fired. The 40mm Bofors guns of USS Missouri defended the battleship against wave after wave of Japanese suicide attacks. The gun crews performed their duties with absolute professionalism and dedication. That engagement with the kamikazes lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. The battle seemed to stretch on forever. The constant firing of the 40mm Bofors guns, the constant loading of ammunition, the constant tracking of incoming aircraft, the constant threat of Japanese suicide pilots intent on crashing their aircraft into the USS Missouri. When it was finally over, when the last kamikazes had been defeated or had been forced to break off their attacks, the gun crews stood down from their positions, exhausted but absolutely relieved to have survived. The USS Missouri had defended itself successfully. The 40mm Bofors guns had performed exactly as designed. The gun crews had executed their training perfectly. Multiple kamikazes had been destroyed before they could reach the battleship. Multiple suicide attacks had been prevented. The battleship had survived the assault without sustaining significant damage. The American Naval Air Defense System had proven its effectiveness. Over the following weeks, USS Missouri would face additional kamikaze attacks. The battleship would be struck by at least one kamikaze during the war. But the 40mm Bofors guns and the skilled gun crews manning those weapons would continue to defend the battleship against Japanese suicide attacks. The gun crews understood that they were the last line of defense. The gun crews understood that their vigilance and their firepower were essential to the survival of the ship. The 40mm Bofors gun represented a triumph of American weapons design and American industrial production. The gun had been developed and refined over years of combat experience. The gun had proven itself to be effective against fast-moving aircraft targets. The gun had saved numerous American ships from kamikaze attacks. The gun had proven itself to be one of the most effective anti-aircraft weapons ever mounted on an American warship. The sailors who manned the 40mm Bofors guns aboard USS Missouri were ordinary men doing extraordinary things. They were young men who had volunteered or been drafted into the Navy. They had received training in gunnery and combat operations. They had faced one of the most desperate and terrifying weapons ever employed in warfare. They had responded with professionalism, courage, and absolute dedication to their duties. They had defended their ship. They had defended their crew. They had defended the honor of the United States Navy. 78 years have passed since that engagement with the Kamikazes. The USS Missouri is now a museum ship where visitors can walk through the spaces where American sailors lived and fought during World War II. The 40mm Bofors guns still stand on the deck of the battleship, monuments to American firepower and American courage. The gun crews who manned these weapons are mostly gone now. The veterans have aged, many have passed away, but the memory of their service endures. The memory of their courage and their dedication endures. And the story of how the 40mm Bofors guns of USS Missouri defended the battleship against kamikaze attacks is a story that will be remembered forever. The memory of that engagement with the kamikazes never faded. The moment when the 40mm Bofors guns of USS Missouri opened fire against Japanese suicide aircraft remains etched in memory with absolute clarity. That single engagement at close range defined everything about what American naval defense firepower really represented. That engagement taught profound lessons about the value of training, weapons technology, and American determination. It demonstrated that when naval forces possessed superior anti-aircraft capabilities combined with well-trained gun crews, suicide attacks could be defeated. It taught the critical importance of having the most advanced weapons systems, combined with professional sailors who understood their duty. The 40mm Bofors guns of the USS Missouri proved themselves to be among the most effective weapons of the entire war. That engagement with kamikazes became part of naval history and military records. But beyond official recognition, it represented something deeper. It represented American naval superiority. It represented the courage of gun crews facing desperate attacks. It represented the professionalism and dedication of every sailor aboard the Missouri. It represented what happened when American military personnel were given the tools they needed and the training they required to accomplish their mission, and it was something that could never be forgotten.